I'm going to tell another story, but trigger warning. It involves tangentially the Chicago Cubs. And I figured that with the week the Cardinals and Albert Pujols has had, I'm safe up here, right? I think I mentioned the Cubs one time at the Chase and I got booed on the high holidays. But here I am again, the icon. When I was in elementary school in suburban Chicago, the fifth graders were given the chance to become crossing guards. You know, the kids who wore the orange belts and helped their fellow students cross the street near our school. As an incentive, those students who volunteered were promised a field trip to a Cubs game at the end of the school year. I was a crossing guard all year, and the day of the trip to Wrigley Field had finally arrived. My fifth grade self jumped out of bed, raring to go. Then I looked out my window and saw nothing but rain. I got to school and we were informed by Mr. Klipowitz, our gym teacher and king of the crossing guards, that our long anticipated day at Wrigley Field had to be canceled. Also, given that it was so close to the end of the school year, there would be no chance to reschedule. Our only reward for the crossing guards would be the satisfaction of having kept everybody safe. We all understood. Even at such tender ages, we realized we couldn't control the weather, that nobody could control the weather. But then, miraculously, the sky cleared, the sun came out, it was still morning, the game wasn't starting till 1:20, which was always the starting time of the days before they put those lights in, but I digress. Surely the Cubs could take the field. The trip was obviously back on. We raced excitedly over to Mr. Clip, as we called him. Alas, the answer was still no. The bus had been canceled. The game might go on, but the crossing guards weren't going to see it. We were upset. We were agitated. It was 1975, and we were raised on news broadcasts filled with protest marches, sit-ins, and walkouts. The crossing guards huddled and an idea came to us. Some would say a conspiracy. When the buzzer went off signaling the end of recess, we crossing guards did not budge. Instead of heading back to class, we massed outside and chanted, "We protest, we protest." That was our only chant. We did it over and over and over. There was a small warming house on our school property for an outdoor skating rink, and a few of us climbed onto the roof and continued our protest from up there, which was pretty cool. This lasted for a good while, but eventually the school responded. First, they set out the nice teachers to reason with us. You know, the ones who knew and loved us from kindergarten. We kept protesting. Then, good cop, bad cop style, the really strict teachers came out to threaten us. Nothing worked. We stayed outside the school until our voices were hoarse, and then we all went to Richard Geist's house, right across the street from the school, to hang out for the rest of the school day and marvel that we had actually participated in a real-life walkout. The next day, all of us crossing guards were called into the office of Mr. Swall, the principal of Brayside Elementary School. And yes, everyone here that's a young person, you will remember the name of your principal from elementary school. Mr. Swall was clearly not pleased. He told us that there had been important guests at the school that day, yesterday, and we had embarrassed him and ourselves with our immature attempt at a demonstration. Mr. Swall told us seriously that we had been bad dragons. Not only that, but he had us wear signs with those words written on them in big letters that we were to wear around our necks all day. I know. Not only that, but we were all to spend the rest of the day in kindergarten classes with our bad dragon signs just sitting there to be bad examples for all the little kids. God forbid they should turn out to be like us. Terrific pedagogy, no? One PS of this story is that I truly remember having a great time with the kindergartners the day of the punishment. I read to them, I helped them, and they thought I was pretty cool for a bad dragon. I actually think that was the first time I recognized that I had somewhat of a gift relating to children. And that experience, honestly, was probably part of the set of circumstances that led me on my life's path. The reason this old story came to my mind recently is because this spring I worked with a teen getting ready for her bat mitzvah, and her Torah portion was Korach. The Cliff Notes version of the story is that Korach and his band of rebels approached Moses in the desert to tell him that he wielded too much power, that all the people were equally holy to Moses. Moses, and more importantly God in the story, disagree. The short-lived revolt is squashed, and Korach and his supporters are killed. This ancient tale led the student and I into a deep conversation about revolutions and protest movements. She said to me that there are always two sides to these disputes. And she argued that the Torah was obviously sympathetic to Moses, to the Moses and God characters, so they became the heroes, and Korach's group became the villains. However, the student argued, if we were allowed to understand the episode from Korach's perspective, we might feel differently. From there, the student surprised me. She said exactly this. For example, nobody in America ever considers the British side when talking about the American Revolution. Turns out her father is from England. And he had discussed with her a point of view that differed from our mainstream version of that famous conflict. Consequently, in her Devar Torah, she wrote, and I quote right from her words, "The Brits felt that they were protecting the colonies by participating in the French-Indian War. Seen from this perspective, the taxes imposed on the Americans, which led to the popular revolt, were intended to be supportive, not punitive. Our American narrative is that we were boldly fighting against tyranny, but she asked us to consider the alternative notion, that the colonists were simply acting like impatient ingrates." It is interesting to note that biblical historians also see the Korach story as one-sided, a useful allegorical device that the lineage of Aaron essentially created to ward off other families that were competing for the priesthood in the ancient Jewish kingdoms. It's an age-old quandary. One person's freedom fighter is another's terrorist, and vice versa. Is your struggle revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? At this point, I do have the voice of one of my rabbinical school history professors in my head saying, there are never really just two sides in any large-scale controversy. Instead, there are a multiplicity of factions that are continually jostling to make temporary alliances with enough of the others to accomplish their agenda. But to state it a little too simply, how do you know if you're on the side of the angels or if you are a bad dragon? One possible answer from our tradition is from the commentary on the story of Korach itself. The rabbis observed that the first words of the portion, Vayikach Korach, contains no direct object. It just basically says in translation, and Korach took, without ever saying exactly what Korach was taking. I'm looking at Ray Slavin. Was this your portion? Oh, Pinchas was your portion. Yeah. Well, good, because I wouldn't want to compete with Ray. From this, they surmise Korach was actually a pretender, a rebel without any cause at all, except for the desire to take what he could for himself. In this interpretation, Korach was merely a taker who didn't really care about a larger mission. He only talked the language of advocating for others when he was truly always and only concerned about Korach. And so eventually the Talmud specifically cited Korach's rebellion as an example of the exact opposite of a righteous controversy. If the cause you are fighting for is ultimately and unquestionably self-serving, and especially if there is a material award waiting for you, like hoping to get to a Cubs game, it's a definite red flag that you're in bad dragon territory. I do not believe this means our tradition frowns upon people standing up for themselves or advocating for one's own family, nation, or tradition. After all, if I am not for myself, who am I is also embedded into Jewish tradition and wisdom. Yet in those situations, when advocating for yourself, there is always a danger of having a Korach-styled taker agenda. And so serious self-reflection is needed to ensure that you are in it for the right reasons when it comes to self-advocacy. On the other hand, participating in the struggles of groups and identities you do not belong to, lifting up the causes of those who you are connected to only as an ally, this decreases the possibility that there are ulterior benefits for you and vastly increases the odds that your involvement is, as the Talmud says, for the sake of heaven. This is most especially true when those people whose side you are taking are vulnerable, taking our cue from our Jewish story, which portrays us as strangers, oppressed, marginalized victims of injustice in the land of Egypt. We are always to remember those origins, that origin story, in order that no matter how established or privileged some of us become, our role is to love the stranger, aid the oppressed, embrace the marginalized, and pursue justice. If I am only for myself, what am I? What does this mean in practical language? If you are financially secure and yet you organize for economic justice, if you are an established citizen and yet you act to protect vulnerable newcomers to our country, including refugees and undocumented people, if you are white and yet protest for racial justice, if you are Christian and yet you fight to preserve religious pluralism and speak out against exclusivist Christian nationalism, if you are a gay or lesbian adult and yet you don't leave behind our trans and gender nonconforming queer kids, if you aren't Jewish and yet you battle anti-Semitism, if you are a man or a person with a body that cannot get pregnant and yet you fight for reproductive freedom, if you aren't Muslim and yet you reject Islamophobia, if you are young and yet you pay attention to the elderly, or you are older yet you mentor youth, if from your side of the political divide you admonish your own allies who dehumanize people merely because they are on the other side, and you try to at least understand worldviews, experiences, and opinions that are vastly different from their own. One of my favorite passages in the Haggadah I compiled many years ago, before I was in rabbinical school, is by the Jewish feminist author Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who said, "There are Egypts right in the middle of our Canaan. Whatever our personal goals and wherever our promised land takes us, we can commit ourselves to choose just one piece from the jagged puzzle of human misery and try to make it better. We can join advocacy groups and work together to combat hate and promote pluralism. We can organize, fundraise, lobby, volunteer our time, speak out, fight for fairer allocations of public resources, give our own money, work in a soup kitchen, demonstrate, yes, even march together again." Here's the part of that passage that's most intriguing to me. She continues, "The mandate is deceptively simple. Imitatio Deo. Imitate what God did for us and do it for others." How do we imitate God? By relieving suffering, by helping to free the oppressed, by undertaking the ritual of empathy and the search for justice as commitments of our own, Thus does the theology of hope inspire the politics of social change. In other words, in our stories, God, though purely spirit, still strives to intercede on behalf of mortals, teaching us that we're not supposed to just stay in our particular lane. We are to sing not only the song of ourselves, but the songs of others too. We're to sing Micha Mocha and Siyahamba. This is by no means easy. These days, we find ourselves living in increasingly isolating times. COVID, our beckoning phone screens, seemingly existential threats around every corner. To many of us, it more and more feels like all we have energy, strength, courage, time, and capacity for anymore is to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. I understand. I completely relate. There is a reason the term quiet quitting is trending wildly. Yet we must not quit each other. In our higher moments, we know that we are interconnected, that despite all of our differences, our fates as human beings are intertwined, and we have a sacred responsibility to serve one another, regardless if the other is a loved one or a stranger to us. We had better reach out across all of our boundaries and lift one another up. And on some level, I have to say this is a rehearsal for the extreme banding together we need sooner rather than later to defend and save the planet, our shared home. Ultimately, there is no them. There is only us. One story that keeps coming back to me as I push myself to stay involved and heed my own words happened back in 2007. I happened to hear about a gathering at the old courthouse to protest a distressing situation in Jena, Louisiana, where a school district was dismissive of nooses that had been hung from what had been dubbed the white tree to intimidate Black students who had dared to sit under it for lunch. All I did was join the crowd on the steps of the old courthouse, listen to the speeches, greet the people who I knew who were there, and then I went back to CRC to continue my workday. Maybe an hour of my time. Rabbi Susan always says the simple act of showing up for people as a steadfast ally can be a powerful act of witness, building community and healing. And a few days later, I discovered the truth of this once again. I walked my kids to Flynn Park School, and after I dropped them off, a fellow parent, an African-American mom, approached me, and she was visibly crying. She reached to give me a hug and simultaneously handed me a folded up newspaper, a copy of the St. Louis American. On the front page, there was a large picture of the Jena protest downtown. And there I was, the only white person in the whole photo. With a marker, she had drawn a circle around my face. "It means so much to me that you were there," she said pointedly, and hugged me again. I know she didn't mean it meant so much to her because our kids go to the same school or because I'm a rabbi. It was because people of color felt under attack again, and I'm white, yet I cared enough to show up at what turned out to be a mostly Black space. There I was, once again in an elementary school, participating in a protest, but this time I did the right thing. This time, thankfully, I was not a bad dragon. As long as we show up for each other, I remain filled with hope for all of us as we start this new year 5783. Let us all choose, as often as humanly possible, to be on the side of the angels, the Shana Tova. Thank you. Reb Nachman of Bratslav taught us that we should make our New Year Rosh Hashanah last as long as possible. The sermon's over, this is something else. I even drew an arrow at the end of the sermon so I could pause enough, but I don't think I did. So, Reb Nachman of Wroclaw taught that we should make our New Year Rosh Hashanah last as long as possible because as soon as the holiday ends, the rest of the year will seem to pass by in the twinkling of an eye. So breathe in these moments that we have shared of renewal, of hope, of transformation, of stillness. Let it settle in. The first motion of the new year, in fact, is stillness, a seed preparing to grow. Looking at my friend Karen Flotty. In autumn, the harvest is gathered, which simultaneously creates the seeds we will soon plant. We do this in the most real and concrete of ways, by seeding the ground. We do this in inner ways as well, by engaging in the spiritual journey our sages called teshuvah, positive transformation, renewal, return to our core goodness. The Jewish year begins at the moment of return, when the fruit of the harvest becomes the seed for the next harvest. Our deepest spiritual truth we learn from the earth. New seed must be planted for any growth to occur. Just as a tiny seed can grow to be a massive tree, I'm reading this book called The Overstory, and now I dream about trees 24/7. Just a tiny seed can grow to be a massive tree. Just a small amount of light, hope, love, and repentance can increase exponentially. As it is written, all you need to create an opening for teshuvah is the size of the opening of the eye of a needle. Even that teeny amount of desire for change will allow the opening to grow, it says, until large wagons can pass through that opening. So this is our great Aleinu on Rosh Hashanah. Increasing the light, growing the hope, our obligations to ourselves, to our communities, and to each other. Please stand if you are able. We're on page